Hello and welcome to this video on costs. So in this video, we're going to look at the relationship between a number of different types of costs. We're going to look at fixed and variable and total cost. We're going to look at total cost and average cost. And then we're also going to look at marginal cost. So let's start off with the basics. What are costs? Costs are money that a business spends running the business, making the products, setting up the business. Sometimes it's referred to as expenditure, and the cost a business incurs normally fall into two categories, fixed and variable. Let's start off by looking at fixed costs. Fixed costs are those costs that do not vary with the amount of business activity, i.e. the number of units that are produced. So these include things like rent, salaries, and machinery. So for example, if we are renting a shop, will the rent ever change? Yes, of course the rent will ever change, but it's not linked to how many items we sell or how many items we produce. So the key part with fixed costs is not to forget the second part. They do not vary with the amount of business activity. Variable costs, on the other hand, do vary with the amount of business activity. So as more is produced or sold, costs will rise. So these examples include raw materials and wages. So for example, if we're manufacturing footballs, the more footballs we manufacture, the more we spend on raw materials like plastic. We can calculate the variable cost by saying, what is the variable cost per unit? Maybe it's €5 per football. Multiply by the number of units. Say we're making 10 footballs. How much are we spending on variable cost? Well, we will spend €50. And as the number of units we make rises, so will how much we spend on plastic, on the variable cost. So total costs are the fixed costs and the variable costs that the business has to pay out. And so remembering that variable cost equals average variable cost times the number of units, so it's going to change as we make more units. If we were to look at a diagram showing us the general relationship, here is a scale with units that we might make. So as we make more units, our total costs rise. But we can see that the fixed costs stay the same. And as we make more units, the amount we're spending on variable costs increases. We're going to talk a bit about total and average in this video. So let's just make sure we're clear. The total cost is the amount a business spends producing all of the units that they produce, whereas the average cost is the total cost divided by the number of units produced. So total fixed cost, how much we're spending, we're paying fixed cost in total, divided by the number of units, and we get average fixed cost. Total variable cost, how much we're spending on things like plastic, raw materials in total, divided by the number of units we produced, we get average variable cost. So here we can see a table showing us some cost data for a business. Here is the level of output that they might produce, and we can see they're increasing each time, so 50 more units each time. The second column here shows us the fixed costs, and what we can see here is these costs do not change as we increase output. So as we increase output on the left, we don't increase how much we spend on fixed costs, so it stays the same. Then we have variable costs. We can see that variable costs are increasing as we produce more. So with more units, for example, if we were to produce 550 units, we'd have to spend 850 on variable costs. Obviously, we don't produce any units, we don't spend anything on plastic and variable and raw materials. We add the two together, and in the final column here, we get total cost. Okay, then we've got average cost in the far right-hand column, and this figure is the total cost divided by the output. So if we've spent £2,500 to produce 50 units, on average, each unit has cost us 50 to produce. If we spend £2,850 to produce 150 units, on average, each has cost us 19 to produce. And what we might notice here, just in terms of this data here, is that average cost is falling, unit cost is falling as we increase output. Here it remains the same, and then actually average cost is starting to rise again. So we can see that here where we've plotted the data. Again, along the bottom, we can see output increasing over time. The fixed costs don't change whether we produce 100 or 150. Fixed costs are fixed costs. Here are our variable costs rising as we produce more units. And if we add the variable cost to the fixed costs, we can see what our total cost would be as we increase the scale of production, as we produce more units as a business. Now let's introduce the idea of marginal cost. Again, this is an important definition. Let's make sure we change this down. The marginal cost is the change in total costs from increasing output by one extra unit. So it is not the average cost, it is what has been the change to the total cost by producing one extra unit. So let's have a look at a table that illustrates that for us. So last time we looked at the average cost and we were happy with calculating that. So we can see our average costs here going down as we increase output. Now the marginal cost is different. It's a different concept here. We're saying what is the change in total costs from producing extra units? So let's have a look at the first example here. If we produce 50 more units, we go from 0 to 50. What's been the change in total cost? Well, the change in total cost has gone up by 500. So we have 500 more cost from 50 extra units. So what have those extra units each added to the costs? Well, 500 extra costs from 50 extra units each, or the last extra unit there added 10. So the marginal cost here is 10. Now let's go on to the next example. We can see that by going from 50 units to 100 units, an extra 50 units, total cost has increased by, from 2,500 to 2,700, has increased by 200. So we have 200 extra cost from 50 extra units. So 200 extra cost from 50 extra units. What has been the marginal cost there? The additional units of each added 4. So the extra unit, that last extra unit, added on 4 to the total cost. So we can see it's not the same as the average cost here. It's looking at the additional costs from adding on those extra units. What has been the marginal cost? Now, if we go a little bit deeper into this, what we can start to see is that here, we know that fixed costs don't change. So the extra 200 here has come just from the variable costs, going from 500 to 200. Again, next time, when we go up another 50 units from 100 to 150, we've added on 1,500 to the cost, and we can see that again is just the increase in variable cost. So only variable costs, only increases in variable cost will have an impact on the marginal cost. The marginal cost is directly related here to the increase in the variable costs. Here we have an increase in variable cost of 150, so going from 700 to 850 over here, and that's come from another 50 units. So how much have those extra units added each? Marginal cost of 3, 150 for 50 extra units. So if we look at the relationship here, we can see marginal cost is going down, and then it's starting to rise as we get towards the end here. So we've calculated our marginal cost, and we can see what's happening to the average cost and marginal cost in this table, just as we discussed before. Now let's look at the relationship between the two. Can we spot any trends here, any relationship between the average cost and the marginal cost? Well, what you might see is early on, the average cost is always falling. And that occurs when the marginal cost is lower than the average cost. So if I look at the first bit of comparison, 10 is lower than 50, and so the average cost falls. 7 is lower than 27, so it's bringing the average cost down. We get to a point here where the marginal cost is the same as the average cost. It's no longer less. Previously here, it was 5, which was less than 13. So at this point, actually the marginal cost is the same as the average cost, and the average cost stays constant. What happens when the marginal cost goes higher than the average cost is that the average cost starts to rise. So we can see a relationship here where marginal cost is less than average cost, the average cost is falling. When marginal cost is the same as the average cost is constant. When marginal cost is greater than average cost is rising. This works quite nicely in a table to illustrate this. The blue line here we have the average cost, and so we could see, early on the average cost starting to fall, and then the red line here shows us the marginal cost. And what we can see is that as long as the marginal cost stays below the average cost continues to fall. So let's just think about that. The marginal cost, remember, is the extra cost from adding extra units. And if those extra units are currently cheaper than the current average cost, well, if those extra units are cheaper than the current average, of course it's going to bring the average down. If you have people lined up in a classroom by height, and you add people who are below the average to that class, short people, it's going to bring the average height of the class down. And that's what we can see here. It gets to a point where the average cost and the marginal cost are the same, and we see that there is no change. We're adding an extra unit with a marginal cost that is the same as the average, and so it's just building on the average. As soon as the marginal cost starts to rise, we can see that this starts to bring the average cost up. So when we're drawing marginal and average cost curves, this is how we're going to be illustrating them. The curve of the marginal cost curve will come into later on, but all we can see is that as long as the average cost is as long as the marginal cost is less than the average cost, then the average cost curve continues to fall. When the marginal cost goes higher than the average cost, then the average cost curve will start to rise. So the marginal cost curve will always cut through the average cost curve at its lowest point by definition. So we must always draw it like this. Now we can add on average fixed cost and average variable cost. So here what we've done is we've taken our variable costs, we've divided by the number of units, and we've got a separate curve here, our average variable cost curve. And so the gap between the two, the gap between the average cost curve and the variable cost curve, by definition must be what is the fixed costs, because fixed costs plus variable costs equals total cost, and the same will obviously apply for averages. I would expect the average fixed cost, the gap here, to get smaller and smaller and smaller over time, because as we spread out the fixed costs across other units, the average will fall. So if I have fixed cost of 2,000 and I have 50 units, the average is 40. If I have fixed cost of 2,000 and I produce 500 units, the average is 4. So as we produce more units, as we move in this direction along the output scale, we'd expect, of course, mathematically, the average fixed cost will get small. So these two curves, the average variable cost curve and the average cost curve, will get closer and closer together. So another rule for us to remember, and let's stay with this, is that we can see here that what's happened, we have the average variable cost curve and we have an initial average cost curve. So we have average variable costs and we have average costs. Now, if the average cost curve has shifted up to average cost curve 2, costs have increased, but the variable costs haven't changed, then this must mean that the fixed costs have increased. Effectively, the fixed costs here have increased from this originally, and then they've increased by this gap here. That's been a change purely in fixed costs. Now remember what we said earlier about the relationship between marginal cost and variable cost. Only if variable costs change will marginal costs change. Fixed costs have no impact on marginal costs. So effectively, here what we can say is if fixed cost change, we will shift the AC curve, but we will not shift the marginal cost curve. As a rule, if fixed cost change, we shift the AC curve, the average costs, but it won't have an impact on marginal cost because that just comes from each extra unit of variable cost. However, if we do have a rise in variable costs, then this will affect both the average cost curve and the marginal cost curve. So here we can see we had a change in costs. The average cost curve has shifted up. And if that has happened as a result of a change in variable costs, it will also shift up the marginal cost curve. So let's take this one down. A rise in variable costs of production leads to an upward shift in both marginal and average total cost. So in this video, we've looked at the relationship between fixed and variable cost and total cost. And we've also looked at the relationship between average cost, average fixed and variable cost, and marginal cost. I appreciate there's a lot in this video. You want to go back through, watch it again more carefully, and just follow along with the logic. That's it. Thanks very much for listening.